This week's parsha is Parshas Re'eh, and there are many mitzvahs in this week's parsha, but we will be discussing a topic which is so relevant and so disturbing, Isur Shrotzim, with tiny little insects, organisms. What are the limits of Isur Shrotzim? So in this week's parsha, Kol Sheretz Oif, Tomei Hilochem, Lo Teuchelu. And the Rambam, Sefer HaMitzvahs, Lo Ta'aseh, from Kufayin Gimel to Kufayin Ches, all the different prohibitions, all the sources of Isur, Machoris Asurais, Minim Hatmeim. From this pasuk we learn flies, bees, little insects are also ba'achila. But before we start the shiur today, I want to dedicate this shiur, L'Refuah Shalema, L'Isha Chashuva, Lona Silvia Bat Miriam, who was suffering from corona and from pneumonia, which usually comes together with corona. This disease is still with us, especially in Eretz Yisrael and many places in the world. And those that think it's over, it's not over. Those that think it's the flu, it's not the flu. It's a terrible disease. Yes, Baruch Hashem, the vast majority of people that come down with COVID-19 will get better and relatively without terrible symptoms, but not all of them will. Some of them will die. We had more than 600 deaths up to this moment in Eretz Yisrael, many more in Jewish communities throughout the world. And many of those that are no longer ill still suffer quite severe symptoms. I know some of them that still have difficulty breathing and terrible weakness and other symptoms. So Luna Silvia Bat Miriam is a relatively young woman, as in her life is in danger. So we daven for her, and we dedicate today's shiur, L'Refuah Shalema B'Korev Luna Silvia Bat Miriam. She should have a Refuah Shalema and have many more wonderful years together with her Chosheva family. She has children, great Talmidei Chachamim. So today we're dealing with a very troubling question, because with every passing day we become more and more aware, with the advance of technology and the advance of research, of tiny little insects that are everywhere, and many fruits and many vegetables we never dreamed in the past that they might be infested are. So we will be speaking especially on the size and tiny little insects which are very hard to remove from foodstuffs. Are they also, is there any room for leniency? So more than 200 years ago, with the advance of very primitive technology, people became aware of tiny little microorganisms in many different foodstuffs. I think the first one that speaks about this is the Chaya Odom, in Binas Odom Yorodea Semelamed Daled. And he brings from Sefer HaBris, his predecessor, that in vinegar, researchers found that there are full of tiny little insects, creepers and crawlers that are everywhere, but especially in vinegar. So some Rabbonim wanted to prohibit and say you cannot use vinegar, because if you look with a magnifying glass or a microscope, you'll see like tiny little animals swimming around in the vinegar. And the Chaya Odom says no. What you cannot see with the naked eye, by halachic definition, is non-existent. So what you cannot see with the naked eye, in regard to halacha, doesn't exist. It has no halachic relevance, and there is no isur of teloim. Reb Shloime Kluger says the same. Tuv, tam, vedas, madura beis, kontras achlen, simen nun gimel. The Aruch HaShulchan says the same. Simen pei daled yoredea, sif lamed vav. So the Aruch HaShulchan says it's not only vinegar, it's even water. When you took a cup of water and put it under the microscope, you'll see like tiny little worms and fish swimming around. Reb Moshe Igris Moshe, the greatest halachic authority of our time, Yoredei Chelik Beis and Even Eza, I think it's Chelik Gimel or Chelik Beis and Nun Aleph. That Moshe says, well, we have those same little microorganisms in the air that you breathe. I don't really understand that, Moshe. So what? So what? Why confuse the pulmonary system with your digestive system? Two different systems. Yes, what you breathe goes into your lungs, not into your belly. What you eat goes into your belly. That is why we have the kona and the veshit. So there would be no isser breathing germs or breathing shlotzim. So the fact that you have these microorganisms in the air isn't relevant, but it is relevant in the water and the vinegar or anywhere else. So all these gedolim come to the very same conclusion. What the naked eye doesn't see does not exist, and therefore there is no Isser Taloim. And this basic principle, this fundamental principle, goes L'Kula V'L'Chumra. Teferes Yisrael, one of the greatest commentators on Mishnayos, Avodah Zorah, Perek Beis, Mishnah Vav, deals with a certain fish that seems to have a sleek skin, a sleek hide. You don't see kaskasim, you don't see scales. But with a microscope, you see that it has tiny little scales. Teferes Yisrael says that's also because microscopic scales are not scales. They don't exist. So the Teferes Yisrael says the same principle, l'chumra, and regarding shrotzim, toiloim, it is l'kula, but the principle is the same. What you cannot observe with the naked eye has no halachic relevance, and that is based on the principle Lo nitna Torah lamalachei shoris. Shalas etshuvas minchas osha chelik aleph siman mem aleph, chelik beis siman nun gimel. But the more important shuv is chelik aleph siman mem aleph. I have a very fundamental discussion about the mere concept Lo nitna Torah lamalachei shoris, and what I made clear there is this sugya appears 3 times in Shas, and I brought 12 or 13 sources from the Poskim and the Rishonim. And in most of these sources, we're not dealing something that man cannot do or cannot see. When Chazal say Lo nitna Torah lamalachei shoris, they don't really mean definitely or dafka angels from above. In most of the sources, hein begemora, hein bepoiskim, we're dealing with something that is possible, it is doable, but it's very difficult. That this is what the Torah expects from human beings. And that also is included in Lo nitna Torah lamalachei shoris, which brings us to a very relevant question. So tiny little worms, you could see them with the naked eye, but it's difficult, it's hard. You need to look very well, and sometimes you need very special conditions to see those insects. So in the Poskim we find there are insects that you cannot see only keneged ha'oyer, when you have light in the background, or when you have a black background. It depends how these insects look. And the difficulty to observe and find some of the tiny little worms is twofold, because of their size and because of their camouflage. So worms usually are the same color as where they are born, what they feed on, where they live. And that is Chachmosai Shel Yoitze Bereishis. Every living creature must have a mean to defend itself from predators. Some animals could defend themselves by fighting back. Well, the African buffalo, the bison, some other herbivores, they're not carnivores, they're not flesh eaters, but they could put up a fight and defend themselves. Some animals defend themselves by their speed. So the deer, the antelope, and many others are faster than the ones that are out to eat them up. And that is the way they defend themselves. Many other animals, their method of defense is camouflage, and the predators have difficulty finding them. So most of the worms that live on fruits or vegetables are the same color as the food they feed on and where they are born and breed. And these two reasons make it very difficult to find them. Would we say Lo nitna Torah lamalachei shoris and there is no Isser of Taloim? No. We find many sources in the Poskim that even tiny little worms and those that are very difficult to find and very difficult to separate, there still is an Isser Talon, and you need to do your best to get rid of them. Chochma Sodom, Yoredeya, Lamet Ches, Siv Chof Ches. He's dealing with fish worms. And the Chochma Sodom writes, these worms are transparent because they breed in water and on fish. So they're transparent, and the only way to notice and see them is with two tiny little black dots with their eyes, because all the rest of their body is transparent and you can't see them. And the Chayodam describes how you could see these worms if you put them into a cup of water and you look at that water on a clear day, you could see them swimming around. So by their motion, you become aware that they exist. And Afal Piken, he says, we need to remove those worms, and that's the Isser Gomer. So the worms are small, they are almost impossible to see, but still, that is an Isser. Many poskim throughout the ages dealt with water that contained worms. Baruch Hashem, our water is purified, it's clean, it's healthy. That wasn't the case throughout the ages in Europe and in other countries. And in many Shulis form, we find a problem about water that was infested with tiny little insects. And that is the same source in which Yochel Shulchan writes, what the naked eye cannot see is not prohibited. But he writes, but those tiny little worms that are found in flour, in water, even though they're very small, very hard to find, but there is an Isser of Telon. The Netziv in Shalas Shuvas Meishav Dover, Chelik Beis Hamachov Zayin Chov Ches, deals with a town. The only water they had was from a nearby pond. But water from that pond was full of tiny little insects which you cannot see. Only Kedeged HaShemesh, when you hold the cup against the sun, and the sun rays, the sunlight is in the background. And if they cannot use that water, the only other source of water would be from a well outside of town, and that well is privately owned, and the owner of the well will ask for a horrendous price sending water to the people in the neighboring town. So then Netziv writes, yes, I know they're full of germs, do your best, try to sift them out, and you could drink the water. But he doesn't say that those worms are not prohibited. They are. Rabbi Yeshua Lemekutner was one of the greatest Gedolim in Poland, and whenever I mention his farm, I just relate him using anecdote. His name was Yisrael Eliyahu Yehoshua. His father gave him three names. The names of the Baal Shem Tov, the Vilna Gaon, and the Pnei Yehoshua. You could put together no better coalition than that. Three giants. The Baal Shem Tov, the Vilna Gaon, and the Pnei Yehoshua. And ultimately he grew to be one of the greatest Gedolim in Poland. Was that because of his names? Maybe. Maybe not. I know some boys, some youngsters that had great names, and not always did it work out so great. And I know some people that have very simple names, good Jews, and they became great Gedolim and great Tzaddikim. So it's not a guaranteed formula. But anyway, Hagoin Rabbi Saul Eliyahu Yehoshua Trunk, Yeshua's Malka, Shalas Tshuva, Simen Yud Gimel Yoredeya. He deals with that very same question. Water from ponds, from rivers that has insects. And he says the same. You need to check that water against the sun, and you need to do your best to remove those insects. Otherwise, you can't use that water. The two most important sources are the Pri Chodesh and the Bach, because they're the two earliest sources. In Yoredei Siman Pei Dalet, both say, as small as insects might be, and as difficult as they are to remove, they still are prohibited. So you need to look for those insects and remove them in the most efficient way. The only ways that you have the means to do so. So the fact that these worms or these insects are very small and difficult to find and observe and remove does not mean that there is no Isser. So obviously in this specific sugya, Roi Nitne Torah Malach HaShoras is only something that is beyond our means. You do not need to use a telescope or a magnifying glass or any other artificial means, but whatever the naked eye could see and you could remove is osor, and you need to stay away from those insects. So I mentioned the tshuva that I wrote, Minchasot Chelek Aleph Mem Aleph, but there's also another tshuva, Minchasot Chelek Gimel Shalosh tshuva Simen Nun. Nun Aleph, Nun Beis, and Nun Gimel. I think there are 4 tshuvas regarding Teloim. And I also spoke about the question of Bitul Barav, which is also a big controversy. Reb Shloime Kluger, in another tshuva, Tufta Vedas, Chelek Gimel Kuf Samech Daled, writes, those tiny little worms that are so difficult to remove and so difficult to find, make it in their bottle barav. Reb Meir Alek Minchas Pitim Yoredei Pei Daled says, no, as long as you could see them, they're not bottle barav. Reb Shloime Kluger's contemporary, Shoel and Meishev, they were the 2 greatest Gedolim of that generation. Madura Aleph, Chelik Beis, and Mem Hey, has a machlokes with the Beis Shloime, also a contemporary, regarding little worms that are found in the liver of animals. I'm not familiar with those worms. I assume today probably that question is no longer relevant. But the Beis Shloime, Tshuvas Beis Shloime Yoredei, Pei Aleph, Pei Beis, Av Simen Pei Vav, asers to use that liver, unless you remove the worms. Shoel Meishev says they're bottle barav because they're so difficult to find. Marsham was a great admirer of the Shoel Meishev, but here he comes out adamantly against them, and he says, Ein lis my cholav. The Marsham, his Sefer Yoredei Elchas Teifes Gilui Das, Simen Mem Aleph, Sivkot and Ted Zayin. 4 different oisias he deals with Hilchas Talom, Yud Gimel Yud Dalet Tes Vav Tes Zayin. He says, as long as you could see those insects, they're not bottle barav, because it's nikar la'ayin. So in my svarim, I dealt with both parts of this question. Tiny little worms or insects, you could see, but it's hard to see, it's hard to find because of the size, because of the shape, because of the color. Hard to remove. One question would be, the other would be, is it bottle barav? Most achronim are machmir, both counts. But there still is a relevant question when those germs are so tiny, you could see them. But in no way could you see the form of an insect. What you see is a tiny little speck of black. Could be 1,000 things. Nature is beautiful. Some of it is, some of it isn't. And in every fruit and every vegetable, they're not perfect. They're not made in a factory out of plastic. Ein patzufein diamonds elazeh. And they're full of tiny little blemishes. We're not aware of that only once a year when you buy an esrog. So when you buy an esrog and you use your magnifying glass and you go under a light and it takes you 10 minutes to look at the esrog and you see a lot of little dots. Green, brown, black, and blue. Most of them ain't worms. So what is the din when you see a tiny little speck of black? You see it without any artificial means, but you can't see what it is. And then the mumche, after doing 10 years of research, he says, this is probably an insect. Maybe, maybe not. Would we say, lo nitne Torah lamalach hashoris? Would we say it's a bottle barav? Maybe. I think so. So this is a matter of discussion and argument between present-day Gedolim. Some bring in the name of Reb Shlomo Zalman Rav Elyashiv, if you could see it, then it's prohibited. You need to be choishish, maybe it's a worm. But I think, lo nitne Torah malach hashoras. Do I need to stay away of every black or brown little speck? I mean, ein ledov v'soif. And if I can't see it's a worm, this is included in lo nitne Torah malach hashoras. Rabbi Yoshua Noiviot, Zechet Tzaddik Levrocha, Shmir Shabbos Karchosa, Perek Gimel, Ha'ora Kuf Hey. In the new edition, it's Ha'ora Kuf Yud Zayin, brings the name of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman. You could see it, but you can't see what it is. You don't see the form. You don't see legs. You don't see antenna. You don't see eyes. You don't see form. All you see is something which is tiny and dark and black. That's not a Isser. And you cannot call it Sheretz or Sheretz Aros unless you see it moving around. If you see it's moving, then obviously it's a living organism. Otherwise it wouldn't move. And I think that is Nochen LaHalocha. And even if we say this does not go into the category of Loin Interam Lachashoros, but it is Mistaver, that at least it's Botel Beroiv. And it's not defined as a Dover Nikar, and definitely not defined as a Beria. Because Bria has a Chashivus. You can't give a Chashivus of a Bria to something that you don't even know what it is. You can't see what it is. All you see is a tiny little speck. That is definitely not a Bria, and I think it would be Botel Beroiv. So these halachas are very complicated, and it's difficult to define exactly size, form, color. Generally, these shiurim are not designated for Psak Halacha L'Maisa. I give shiurim Halacha L'Maisa in Koilel, in the different Koilelim I give shiurim in. The weekly shiur is more about analyzing sugyas and shashua shel Torah, to see the beauty of Torah, the complexity of Torah, and the clarity of Torah. That is my objective. So once again, I have no intention now to giving clear psak, but rather discussing the fundamentals in Hilchos Teloim, and especially the unique shilas that come out in our generation when we have the tools and we have the means, and we know so much about microorganisms, and we know so much about the invisible and the tiny little world we live in. So sometimes it's hard to imagine, but now with COVID-19 it's very easy to imagine. Yes, there's an invisible world out there. And when you cough or sneeze, even when you talk, you are dispersing thousands, millions of tiny little particles that the naked eye doesn't see. Little droplets of saliva, which contain viruses, bacteria, and you disperse in many different ways, even when you breathe, organisms. So whatever the naked eye can't see, in halacha is not relevant. In medicine it is. And how? So, by halachic definition, these are non-existent. In biology, oh, they are. And microbiologists know a great deal about them. So once again, our question is, when a little insect, a little organism, is big enough to see it without artificial means, it's far bigger than bacteria or viruses, but it is so small that you cannot really see its form. Would that be osur or not? If it would be osur, would it be botel barav or not? That is open for discussion. One of the fascinating sources which none of the Achronim brought is Piskei Maharash, who was the Rebbe of the Maharil going back more than 700 years. And he is the first one that deals about Mei Be'erois, water from the wells that have tiny little worms that are difficult to see. Oni neged zrichas hashemesh. And I don't know whether it means b'shas zricha or against sunlight. Probably against sunlight. B'shas zricha, it's not that light. So why would it be associated with a zricha? Probably he means b'shosha shemesh zoreach. And he writes there is no Isser at all. Fascinating and surprising. Goes against all the Achronim that I mentioned. Unless we would argue, it depends how big. So most of the Achronim I quoted are dealing with insects and worms. The difficulty to find them and see them and observe them is because of the camouflage. Like the ones in the water that are transparent. like the ones in Chassid that are green. So maybe the Marash deals with something that is so small that it's almost impossible to see. But nevertheless, this is a source which none of the Achronim bring. They didn't have Piskei HaMarash in their time. But it's an important source because the Ramon Choshemish B'Tzimachov Eisiv Beis writes, when we find something in the Rishonim that the Achronim weren't aware of, if the Achronim were aware of, and they disagree, then Aloche Basroi, Aloche Achronim. But if that source of the Rishonim was unknown to the Achronim, we should assume that if those Achronim would see this Rishon, Hoyom Avatlim Da'atom, Im Rishonim Kamaloch Amono Kibnei Yodom, Vim Rishonim Kibnei Yodom Mono Kechamoirim, V'Aloche Rishonim. Shach, I think it's Siv Kotten, I don't recall which Siv Kotten, maybe Siv Kotten Vav. Shach strengthens what is found in the Ramah. And this is a very important source in Piskei Marash, who was the Rebbe of the Maharil, Megidolei Ashkenaz. So at least it could be a source, at least to argue, that when those organisms are so small that you cannot even see their form, that would not asa. Shalas HaTshuvas Shivas Sion. Bnoi Mamala Makoyma Shel Anoide B'Yehuda, Reb Shmuel Lando was the Rav in Prague after his father passed away. Simachov Ches, he comes up with a totally new argument, which tosses up the entire sugya. And he writes, if you swallow a worm and you weren't aware that you're eating a worm, it's a mesasik. And a mesasik is not an isidiuraisa at all. Rabbi Kiva Eiger, Chuvas Rabbi Kiva Eiger, Kama Siman Ches, is the only achron that says mesasik pota mekorban, but it's an isidiuraisa. Everyone disagrees with Rabbi Kiva Eiger. So this is a totally new he'ora of the Shivas Sion. Imre Bino, Reb Meir Auerbach, was one of the greatest Gedolim HaPoilan, and Sof Yomov in Eretz Yisrael Yerushalayim. Hilchas Bosa B'chol of Simen Beis. Shalosh Tshuvas his Oiris Tshuva. He was a son of the Ksav Sofer, an enikel of the Chsam Sofer. Chelik Beis Siman Lamed Zayin quotes his uncle, who carried the same name. Son, second son of the Chsam Sofer, Reb Shimon Sofer. And Reb Shimon Sofer number 2 quotes his uncle, Reb Shimon Sofer number 1, this very same argument. He doesn't bring the Shivas Sion, who was one generation older than him. So all these come up with the new ha'ara. If he's not aware that he's eating worms, it's a mesasik. But this cannot be, because it goes against all the poskim. Hundreds of years, the Bach, the Prichodesh, and all the Achroinim. So why do we need Bedikas Teloim? Why do you need Bedika B'chlal? If he has no intention of eating worms, it's a mesasik. I think it's a mistake. Mesasik is only when he's not aware he's doing an Aveira. He's not aware that he's doing a Maisa Aveira. Kasava Roiku Ubeloi, that's mesasik. When a person thinks he's swallowing saliva, but it's not saliva, it's yain nesach that he has in his mouth. But he forgot that he put something in his mouth, and he thinks he's just swallowing saliva. Swallowing saliva is not defined as achila. It's something natural. It's something you do without intention. It's like blinking your eyes, like your lung is breathing. That is mesasik. But nischaven lechal bosar talev olo biyode bosar chazi is a shoygig. It's not mesasik. It's an iser b'shoygig. So you take a spoonful of salad and you put it into your mouth and you eat. You have clear intention to eat whatever you put in your mouth. You're not aware that there are germs, that there are insects, that there are worms. That's not a mesasik, that's a shoygig. Because you have intention to eat what you put into your mouth. And what you put into your mouth contains worms. So that's not a mesasik, that's a shoygig. That's exactly like neschaven lechol bosor tale va'ola biyodei bosar chazia. And that's an isagomer b'shoygig. So you need to stay away. Especially if if you know there might be worms and you don't do a bedika, it's no longer a shoigig. Then it's a posheya. Korev lemezid. So that is my idea. However, the Marsham, the source I quoted, Gilui Das, Yoredeh, Elchas Treifes Sivkot Mem Aleph. The Marsham does argue, but if those insects are so small, there's no Hanoas Groinoi, there's no Hanoas Mayav, Chunan Kuv Gimalom et Bezis, or Machloikes Eb Yerchen Ever Shlokesh, regarding Macholas Asuris. What is the essence of Macholas Asuris? Hanoas Groinoi or Hanoas Mayav? But the Mesham says if these worms are so tiny and so few, no benefit, no pleasure, nothing. No Hanoas Groinoi, no Asama, why would it be Osir? It's a Ha'ara. I want to say more than that. If we're dealing with, I can't even call them worms, but organisms that are so small. You see them, but you can't see what they are. They're so tiny. I'm not sure this could be defined as achila. What is achila? What is eating? You put something in your mouth. You're aware, you feel it in your mouth, on your tongue, and you swallow it, which means you're using the muscles of your mouth, of your tongue, to push it down your throat. You can't swallow a speck of dust. No, it doesn't work. So if this insect is so tiny, like the tip of a needle, I don't think it's shaykh maisa achila. It'll probably go down to your belly at some stage with your saliva. But it is so small, you're not even aware it's in your mouth, in your tongue. And you won't swallow it down. It'll just stay either between your teeth or in your gums or on your tongue. When you're not even aware it's in your mouth, would that be defined as achila, tzorchiyun, tzorchiyun, tzorchiyun beinai? So yes, when those worms are part of a strawberry or of an apple or of a salad, and you swallow the salad, it's going to go down as well. But my suffix is, could that be defined as a dvar isur, as isur shrotzim, if it's so small, and each one into itself, it's not shaykh ma'isa achila, tzorchiyun. So I'm just continuing the strain of thought of the Marsham and taking it to a greater extreme. So as I said, my intention today was not paskaning halachas, but just giving you a brief overview and analysis of the various different chakiras and shailas that come up in our days more than in the past. The sources we quoted are all from the past, but today we are far more aware of tiny little insects and organisms that are almost everywhere. And so on one hand we're dealing with the Isser Chomer, Telom is a Isser Chomer, and you need to do your best to stay away. Like all Macholas Asuris, besides the Isser, Chazal also say, Metamtim Libo Shalodam, and we all want a pure heart and a pure mind. And our hearts and minds are affected by Macholas Asuris, so do your best to stay away from any Chashash Macholas Asuris.